You never know when you can become disabled. It is something that affects eventually everyone. Accessibility is not just for disabled communities, it is for everyone.
Hey Gooby, you're now listening to Buddy Time. On today's episode, we're diving into topics of disability inclusion and pride, featuring our guest speaker, Shane Bhatla. Ready to turbocharge your day with us? Let's begin our voyage! Hello listeners, today we'll be highlighting once again the importance of the topics surrounding the LGBTQIA plus people, but also more specifically in the growing landscape of Thailand's development in this particular agenda. And today's topic is something in which I am quite foreign to and feel like it's never really talked about enough in our everyday discussions, especially I would say in the workforce as well. I'm very grateful for Shane, who is here to talk to us and discuss with us, perhaps even educate us on the topics of disability inclusion, especially in the gay and queer community. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you listeners to Shane. Hi Shane, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. It's been a great morning so far.
Would you like to introduce yourself to the listeners?
I would love to. Hi, I'm Shane. I use he, they pronouns, and I am a non-binary trans disabled activist and consultant based in Bangkok. Essentially, I work on a lot of issues that surround the trans and non-binary communities and also communities that are disabled and neurodivergent. As a person who is disabled and neurodivergent myself, I take massive pride into the work that I do and integrating that into especially like the LGBTIQ community, because I personally believe that intersectionality is so important, and bringing those two topics together really take into consideration my own identities and how I operate in the world and how I view the world.
When we talk about and discuss about the LGBTQ plus community, the topics that we talk about, normally what we hear on the news and like just on headlines or people discuss it, it's really shallow. It's just on the surface, like, oh, you're gay, you're lesbian. But there are so many more layers to, I feel like, just what makes us human, such as the disability that we're talking about today. I feel like it's so important as well that we first identify and also describe what does it mean in terms of being like disabled or all these keywords that you throw out. I feel like as for myself as well, I'm really foreign to this. I don't know what exactly like neurodivergent could mean. So could you explain a little bit more about these keywords of what does it mean to be disabled?
Absolutely. So neurodivergent is a term that was coined not too long ago and popularized not too long ago. It essentially means that your brain works differently from what the neurotypical way of operating in the day-to-day world is. So a lot of our spaces are created without taking the differences of how our brains work in mind, right? To the point where we don't even know how most of our brains operate. So neurodivergence is a word that is an umbrella term for any psychosocial conditions that we might be diagnosed with or might not. Self-identification and self-determination is a big part of neurodivergence, because a lot of people don't have the opportunity to get a formal diagnosis, whether it's because of not having enough finances or not having access to the appropriate healthcare. Me, for example, I have ADHD. I think I'm also a little autistic. I'm not really sure yet, but I haven't really gotten a formal diagnosis for the autism, but I have had a formal diagnosis for my ADHD. I also have complex PTSD because of my past experiences that were not so nice, and anxiety, and I've had depression before. So all of these conditions are also considered under neurodivergence, just because the way that I view the world and the way I operate in the world is different from those who don't have these neurodivergence. That is what neurodivergence is, in simple terms, right? So anyone who has depression, schizophrenia, bipolar, BPD will also all come under neurodivergence.
Do you have any facts and figures from the top of your head of how many people suffer from disability in the queer community?
In the queer community specifically, I think 1 in 4 self-report having a disability, either one or more. So 1 in 4 people self-report having a disability, one or more disabilities in the LGBTIQ community. This number is more amongst the trans communities. So I think that is 1 in 3. There's a research that actually came out recently with like very deep correlation about transness and neurodivergence. So it is more likely for someone who is trans to identify also as neurodivergent and someone who's neurodivergent to also identify as trans, which I think is so beautiful because the community came up with this amazing word that I love to use. It's called neuroqueer. So it's someone who has the intersectionality of neurodivergence and also queerness. And it's a very popularized term in our community, at least. Another word that we really love to use is neurospicy.
I love that.
Right. That's just like not vanilla, not the way that other people operate, but it's just like a little bit of spiciness in the way that we think.
I'm wondering because back then, before I hear about, all the disability, neurodivergent, before just a minute ago, right? All of my knowledge was just pretty surface level that I thought, oh, okay, everyone will experience depression, ADHD, all kind of psychological, mental situation. Even for normal people, we're not just talking about like queer friends, right? Back then, I thought that, it's probably because the environment is really bad, our upbringing, our background, are all of these factors that make our life a lot more difficult. That's why people were affected by all of these bad experiences. I'm also wondering, like, especially in the queer, because back then, I thought that people have opinions on queer friends. They will basically being judged, right? The queer community being judged. And I thought that, maybe that's the reason for why there are more queer friends who experience neurodivergent. So I'm wondering, so what's your thought on this? Is it really because of the judgment from, the society that made our queer friends has more are being impacted more on their mental health, or it's also just from their how their surrounding, their environment?
There are a lot of factors why poor mental health or more degrading mental health is such a big part of our communities. One thing is, how the society treats us, right? And another thing is, I think, and this is like so important that a lot of folks don't talk about, and that is how much responsibility that is on us to educate other people. And doing this day to day, I think it gets very exhausting to the point where the questions that are asked, especially to trans people, can be very invasive. So for example, about like surgeries, about who your partner is, like what genitals, like very, very invasive. Very recently during the Olympics, this is what we saw with Iman Khalif, who is a cis woman. But the fact that transphobia is affecting cis women and their mental health is already a precedent of what has been happening to trans people for the past decades, past centuries, right? So there is a direct correlation and effect to how our mental health is affected because of the transphobia and homophobia we face. Every time there is a case that comes out in the news, which happens very often, like 2022 was the deadliest year for trans murders, for example. I think I can't remember the numbers correctly, but I think it was over 300 trans murders around the world. And those were just the ones that were reported. So you can already think about the news that is coming out and the news that is coming out around our identities. And when we see like these constant negative perspective and representation of us in the media, it is hard not to let that affect us, right? And so, yeah, absolutely, it does affect our mental health in a negative way. But one thing I think that like the LGBTIQ community does really well is community care and providing support amongst each other. Like the trans community does this really well. We have a lot of resources that are made by organizations. APTN is a really good organization that talks about healthcare a lot. And I think having resources like that really shows that the progression in our communities are really, really increasing, which also benefits our mental health a lot. There's a lot of work that is being done in Thailand too, in terms of improving the mental health of LGBTIQ young people, especially. So I think Save the Children recently did a research about LGBTIQ young youth and young people and their mental well-being in schools and in day-to-day life. And I believe it was ages 15 to 25 or 23, something like that. But in that report, they also said that when they called in to crisis hotlines, that they felt understood by the person who was responding to their crises, which I think is really beautiful. But at the same time, we've got so many different communities that are also being forgotten. So, for example, trans-masculine communities have the highest rate of depression and anxiety. And this is potentially could be because the representation of trans-masculine communities is so minimal. When we see representation of trans communities, it's mostly trans women, trans feminine representation, especially in the Southeast Asia like region, right? Like also misogyny and patriarchy, the way that it affects young men, boys, including trans-masculine folks, also could be a potential reason why the rates are so high amongst trans-masculine people. But I definitely recommend, if you haven't read that research that is done by Save the Children, I think it really shows how beautiful the progress have been, but it also shows how much the gaps are in our educational system and like in terms of bullying, whether it's online or in person. So I think it's really well done.
I think it's really beautiful, Shane, that you brought this up about how there are progresses of organizations that's really helping to push for this agenda and support for these community of people. And also it's so interesting that you brought up the word education, about how people needs to be educated on all these things. And it makes me question as well, because you did talk about how a lot of trans people especially, they get asked questions about like the operations that they've perhaps gone through and all these things, just so that we can help also maybe make a clearer direction for people who are listening to this. How would you recommend them in going about this sort of discussions, this sort of topic with a trans person?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question, because I think one of the things that I often bring up is your trans friend is not the only trans person in the world. So there are multiple resources out there on the internet that if you just Google that, you will be able to find it easily. But obviously, like there needs to be like some form of critical thinking. If you have a tendency of Googling like pretty conservative material, the material that will come up for you is mostly anti-rights and anti-trans narratives. So like some of the organizations that you can look towards, APTN, which is the Asia Pacific Transgender Network, and they do really, really good work. TGEU, which is Transgender Europe, I believe. Another great resource is TSER, which is the Trans School Educational Resources. And they have this educational resource of, I think it was the Gender Unicorn, and it basically explains romantic attraction, sexual attraction, gender identity, gender expression, sex characteristics, and like a few different things. They also have a resource on pronouns and things like that. So there are a lot of resources out there, even when you have questions like about surgeries or about the safety of surgeries, about the safety of hormone blockers. Your trans friend doesn't have to do all the work. Your trans friend doesn't have to do any of the work. But if you really want to have a proper conversation with your trans loved one about their identity and their life, it is best to approach it with consent. And that is to, would you be comfortable talking about this? I will try to be as respectful as possible. There might be sometimes that I might get things wrong, and I hope that we are both patient with each other while we navigate through this conversation. And it's as easy as that. What is really harmful is when people with malicious intent usually come in and, without asking consent, just give a question that is very invasive, like, have you had your surgeries yet? Like, the only reason why you should be knowing that is if we are in a relationship. And if we are not, and if you're a stranger, then there's no reason. Do not ask.
Don't ask that question.
Do not ask, because I will not tell.
When we speak of disability inclusion, we did touch upon what neurodivergent is. In my own understanding of disability as well, there's so many different forms of disabilities. The neurodivergent, I would classify it myself as like the mental disability, right? And there are also physical disabilities that we could go through. So I'm wondering, in terms of these disabilities, how is the current landscape and the current environment at all helping these people?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because, so just to give a little bit of a background in terms of policy, Thailand has ratified to the CRPD, which is the Commission of Persons with Disabilities, that it's basically a UN convention and a UN process, which essentially gives the opportunity for other countries to recommend Thailand with certain recommendations that they can apply or they can choose to ignore. However, there isn't much space for us to hold our governments accountable in this sense. Thailand, for example, has skipped their previous state reports, and without them providing a state report, as nonprofits, we can't then provide our nonprofit reports or our shadow reports. The UPR process, which is the Universal Periodic Review process, is very, very complicated, and it requires like a lot. Like, I could go on for an hour about how this works, but this is how the policy level works, right? What this means is Thailand has basically said that they will make things accessible for people with disabilities or for disabled persons. Accessible in terms of infrastructure, in terms of finance, in terms of education, in terms of protection against violence, in terms of equal marriage. However, Thailand lacks a lot of these things. The infrastructure, for example. If you walk down Sukhumvit Road, let's say from Emporium all the way down to Thonglor, the infrastructure currently is in a mediocre state. As a wheelchair user, you will not be able to make it from one spot to the other without coming across no ramps, without coming across no safe crossing from one side to the other that doesn't require steps. You will not see even footpaths. You will see a lot of potholes. You will see motorcycles on the pavements and things like that. And so
if we even just put like disabled people aside, even for normal people, the facilities are not very supportive, like potholes, like you said.
Exactly.
It's everywhere. It's so hard to even walk on our own feet. How are we expecting wheelchairs to be able to wheel through those potholes, right?
To navigate certain things like that. And some of the pavements and some of the sidewalks are so narrow that you can't even fit a wheelchair through that. And it's a scary situation. And it's not just wheelchair users. We're talking about folks who use walking canes and white sticks. White sticks are essentially for the blind. blind folks use it to navigate their surroundings. There are multiple types of white sticks. So it depends what kind of sticks that they require. So like even for them, it's not accessible because you will notice that on the sidewalks, we have this one tile that is a different color, and it has like lines on it that is protruded on our sidewalks. And that is essentially to navigate for blind folks with their sticks. And it's for them to show them the way. And it's a really, really, really great initiative. But the way that it's done here in Bangkok, especially, it doesn't help. So for example, once you get to the end of the sidewalk and there's a ramp going up or like there's just a drop, it doesn't indicate that there is a drop. And so it really leaves it to disabled people to find their own way to navigate around the city, right? But even with folks who are hard of hearing or who are deaf, for them, it's not easy to navigate Bangkok either because everything is audio. You'll see even in the BTS, most things are auditory cues. Like in the hospitals are much better, but like in majority of the places, if you stay at a hotel, it is more likely that the alarm systems, fire alarms, will be auditory. My condo, for example, all the fire alarm systems are auditory. If I was deaf or hard of hearing, I wouldn't be able to hear that. The only way I would be able to figure it out if it was my cat freaking out.
What is that? But cat freaking out can also be for multiple.
Exactly. So that's my only visual cue, and it's a terrifying state, right? Like emergency response or emergency planning doesn't take into consideration disabled folks either. And there's so many kinds of disabilities. So it's really hard to do a one-size-fits-all. So you really need to take into consideration like what access needs someone has. For example, someone who is shorter might require a shorter bed. Someone who is an ambulatory wheelchair user might also require a disability-friendly parking spot. But the moment you walk out the car after you park in a disability parking spot, suddenly you have eyes turned on you and questions like, are you really disabled?
I actually there's a special place in hell for those who park and they're not disabled in the disabled parking spot. Because like we talk about just parking in general in Thailand, it's really hard to find, especially in the city. And then sometimes I do see people who are totally fine using a disabled parking spot. Because we're talking about the physical disability and also mental disability, is it appropriate to categorize them as just disabled people and they can also park in the disabled parking spot? Because I do have a question that I feel like it is much more easier to identify a physically disabled person than from a person who's mentally disabled. What are your views in this particular topic?
When it specifically comes to accessible parking spots, I think it's very safe to say that we don't have enough, because even with someone who has a neurodivergence, they might require an accessible parking spot, right? So for example, if someone has very high anxiety or has CPTSD or PTSD from going into a mall, so they would want a accessible spot that is closest to the door, go in, do whatever they need to do, and then come out right away, so that their PTSD is not triggered or their anxiety is not triggered. And these are also very relevant reasons why someone would need an accessible parking spot. Not all invisible disabilities are also psychosocial. So what that means is there are a lot of folks who have dynamic disabilities like I do. Sometimes I need a walking cane. Sometimes I need a wheelchair. Sometimes I don't need either. But that doesn't change my need for using an accessible parking spot. if I walk for long distances or if I stand for long distances, that affects me to the point where the next day I might be in bed all day. I might not be able to participate in social activities or in even at my job effectively if I didn't have that accessible parking spot, right? So for example, I have this condition called vasculitis, which is triggered by being in the sun for too long too. So I get like rashes if my veins get inflamed. And so for me, an accessible parking spot is so important so that I can avoid being in the sun for too long. I can avoid long distances. I can go in, do my thing, come back out, leave right away. Thailand does have a very bad reputation for giving accessible parking spots to folks who might not need it, because there isn't any specific way of identifying who requires it and who doesn't. But even if there was a mechanism in order to identify that, it would still not be helpful for everyone. It would still not be helpful for those who actually need accessible parking spots.
Because there's just so many different, like you say, a variety of different disabilities out there.
Exactly. So for example, like even the disability card that is given out to Thai citizens who have disabilities doesn't include a lot of the things that people actually require the disability card for. You need to show a certain amount or a certain level of disability, or you need to have one of the very few listed psychosocial disabilities that the government decides that this is the only thing that should be accounted for. And for the rest of us, we're stuck. We don't have access to that.
It sounded like a double-edged sword to me, because let's say we really want to help the disability friends in general, whether or not it's mental or physical, especially for mental. It's hard for normal people to identify that, oh, you're part of that, so you are eligible to, let's say, park here, or you might need more help than something like that, right? It's hard to tell. Let's say if we want to be able to identify this group of people, then maybe a card such as the disability card would help, because I can just show you that, oh, I am this type. But at the same time, it's just the same issue as the LGBTQ, like you're being labeled right away. In order to be helped, you need to label yourself first. So that's a bit, so should this happen, or shouldn't this just be a thing that, people can just do, like without labeling? So I'm not really sure how to, if there's a like perfect solution for this. So it's interesting too, because especially in Thailand, a lot of the private malls, we see privileged parking for ladies parking, VIP parkings. All of these people, all of this space are guard, like with guards as well. Like, oh, you're a lady, okay, I'll open the entrance for you. Oh, you have a VIP sticker, I'll open the entrance for you to park. But how about, let's say, like accessible parking for people who really need? So how can, if we need like a identification process, so do we also have a space, an entire parking space for disability friends? But in order for us to prove that we are eligible to park here, we need to prove that, yeah, we are disabled. How does that make, people who actually are feel, right? I would feel so bad that I need to prove myself that you don't need to remind me that I am disabled again, right?
I think it's a very interesting discussion we're having here, because I do understand the need to not want to be labeled a certain sense, but then again, it's hard to identify if you like I'm going back to the first thing I said earlier, that there were people who just parked in the disabled place, and then I was very quick to judge. I'm just like, hey, how dare they, park there? But Shane quickly said all the things, and then I quickly reflected and was like, maybe I was very quick to judge. Maybe they do have some sort of disability, but it is more mental that I can't see. But when they walked out of the car, they looked perfectly fine. They could be someone who suffers from high anxiety. at the mall or wherever the parking space was. So it's a very interesting thing that I'm very quickly reflecting on. I personally do feel like we can't win all the time. So I feel like if it is potential, an identification card is useful in the sense that it's similar to the concept of like a VIP car. When you want to park at a certain VIP place, you want to identify yourself as, hey, I am a VIP user of whatever card that you're using to park there. And I agree with you, Sin, that I feel like in the disabled people's zone, there should also be much more care than just leaving it there, because I feel like if anything, these people need more help than those with VIP cards. But having that identification, I think, can be useful, because I feel like that can identify them that they have the need to use this particular spot. But at the same time, I really also understand that some people don't want to be, pigeonholed into like, I have anxiety or I suffer from this and that. And this is where I think the sensitivity comes in as well.
And I think it's really refreshing that we're having this conversation too, because one of the things that I have been a true advocate for is we don't need that kind of labeling. We don't need to prove our disability in order for us to use things that should be already accessible to us. What I would say is removing the VIP slots and turning them into accessible parking instead, because I'm pretty sure a BMW can park a little further and walk over rather than someone who requires an accessible parking spot. Because like I was at Major Ikamai and they have 3 accessible parking spots in the entire building. 3 accessible parking spots that does not require stairs. And even then, there are like a few steps. But the fact that there are only 3 accessible parking spots and they're mostly always full, I just drive down and park in one of the lady spots. Because it's like, if you're not going to have an accessible parking spot for me, I am going to fight you. You either give me a VIP spot, because no one is parked there. It's literally empty. Or you find me a spot that I can access these services, because it's not my responsibility in order to do this, right? But this is a massive issue worldwide, that the lack of accessible parking spots is so massive that the access needs are not met ever. And we can't blame our disabled peers for it. We can't say, oh, I need this more, or you need this more, or my partner needs this more, or my relative, my loved one needs this more. You just have to find a way to navigate it together and blame the government for it and blame the infrastructure for it, because that's what it is. Like, for example, I went to the Queen's Circuit Convention Center and they have accessible parking spots, 6 on each floor. And that's great, because then they never get full. And they have like accessible parking spots for those who use a wheelchair and for those who don't. And it's, I think, the most beautiful thing that I've ever seen. It's one of the most accessible parking spots that I've seen. And it's not hard to do it because we have the space. And I think it's just lazy on the side of people who build certain parking slots and parking lots to not include this.
I'm going to slide in a pretty, in my opinion, quite controversial, or even I would say a little aggressive. Spare me, like if anything, it's like sounds a little offensive or anything. So if I were to bring in the economic contribution factors, especially if we're talking about private sectors, like let's say the big malls, because if we're just talking about like parking space, I am assuming if I were to think from the perspective of an investor, then I would prepare facilities that, in my opinion, people who would more likely to visit my place, let's say let's say for a mall, and for some reason, this owner of this mall thinks that majority of the people who have the ability or potential to visit my mall are not really disabled people. So that's why I would rather invest more onto, quotation, more normal people. But that means they are forgetting about, let's say, the minorities, right? So this could be one of the reasons for why, some countries, some institution focus more on, the bigger group of people. But what's your thought on this? Because maybe that is the reason why some people consider things. Of course, the better way to consider or invest into, let's say, a service industry is consider the general people, the more like not just the major people, but also the minority. Just like the example you gave us now, Queen Circuit, they consider both sides of the people. So, but in a way, if I were to also put into the economic contribution part, is maybe Queen Circuit Center, they are considering to bring in more minority people to their space. That's why they're opening up these areas for these people. Right?
The thing is, I feel like I've been thinking about this throughout the discussion that we're having, and like it depends on how we're defining normal people as well in your case, because from my end, I feel like if we identify normal people as people who bring in money, then sure, that I think is their goal, because the goal of a mall is for them to make money through the things that they sell within the mall itself, right? But I've been thinking about this and about like parking, like we're using parking spaces as a prime example right now, but it's not the only example for sure. Personally, I was thinking, because Shane did also mention about like removing VIP spaces for and then turning it to either just a normal or for disabled people, because they don't need that much space, right? So I was thinking if we also include, like, say, neurodivergent people or mental disabilities as disabled people, there is a lot, like I don't know the numbers for sure, but I'm sure that from going around and just the people around me, I know that there's so many people who suffer from mental challenges themselves in their daily lives. So do we categorize that as being disabled as well? Because is depression being disabled, or, all these things? Because we did talk about being hyper anxious and things like this. So if we talk deeper into this particular topic, I have that question. It's just a question in my mind. If we do consider that, then to me, we just have to go to like the bare basics of everything in life, which is just basic equality. So there's no labeling, no ladies, no disabled, no nothing. Just everybody is a fair game for all, because we don't know what people are suffering through and things like that. So sure, we don't have the VIP place, but then how about people who are normal people? But then, like, technically, if I'm diagnosed with like ADHD, I can also use that. But then I myself don't want to be labeled as a person who suffers from that. So I don't have, going back to like identification cards, I don't have that. So can I park? Should I park? It becomes complicated,
It's like a whole cycle happening.
Yeah.
It just sounds so complicated.
No, it's this is great, because when people sit down to have conversations around access needs and around identifying disability and around whether able-bodied people should be able to use certain privileges in quotation marks as disabled people, these are the topics that come up a lot, and these are the conversations that come up a lot. And like it is complex. It's not easy. I think it just comes down to community responsibility. And it is that if you do not require an accessible spot at that time, do not use it. And it's just as easy as that. A lot of people do not know this. A lot of people are unlikely to know this. For example, I will go to a mall, and on some days I do not require it. Or on some days that there is a spot that is also nearby that I'm okay to use. So I will not use the accessible parking spot, because there is already a convenient spot that is very, very nearby, and it meets all my needs. So there are people like that who will also do that, who are disabled and who you require the accessible parking spots, right? And it is just for community care and it's just for community responsibility because for me, I think, okay, I'm not using my wheelchair today. If I was to park in this spot rather than this spot, for someone with a wheelchair to get out would be a lot more difficult if I parked in this spot. So for me, the ideal decision is, let me just take this spot instead, so that someone else doesn't have to worry about how they're going to make it in.
You know, this reminded me of one of these, not like this, should I call it issue? Not really an issue, but it happens as like a topic that people were talking about like back then for several times, which is, we all know these special seats on BTS on subway, right? I think in the past, there were several times where people about it, which is, for example, there were cases where this young lady who were sitting, it was during prime time, all the seats were taken, and then there was this young lady sitting on one of these, the so-called disability seats, or the seats for the seniors, priority seats. So this young lady was just sitting there, and suddenly there's this senior who came and then requested the young lady to go away and like give the seat to the senior. But then the young lady refuses. Like there were several times like articles about this. But why it generated the talk? It was because the young lady actually was experiencing menstrual pain, cramps. So she felt really, really, like, but she wasn't showing it like, hey, I'm, on my period and I'm really feeling bad. So that's why I really need the seat. But then the senior in their own perspective is like, you're a well, like looking good young lady, you're young, like why are you taking up the seat, right? It reminded me of this kind of situation where I think I totally agree. It's all about the community's mindset to just be more considerate to whatever that's offered to us. If parking situation, if we feel like we can just park somewhere else and not the accessible parking spot, that's fine. It's we have that choice to make. And if, let's say, on the BTS, on subway, if we feel like, oh, I think I don't really need to be seated, or I can stand just one more station, I can also choose to do that. Right? I think that's the whole point of it.
I feel like hearing this particular news incident that happened, to me, I would solve it simply by communicating, because I feel like the adult in this case, or the elderly in this case, did not communicate. That's why there was also this misunderstanding. They did not know what the young girl was going through, which brings me to a very interesting question as well about like communication and all these things. I'm wondering, for people with disability, how can we appropriately communicate to them or ask them whether or not they're suffering certain challenges in their lives?
I think it's very interesting, which is the point I was about to bring up just after this, because around the world, we have these really great identifiers of invisible disabilities and of chronic illness. Chronic illness is anything that you are affected by in your day-to-day life, whether it's pain, fatigue, or anything, even menstrual pain. Heavy menstrual pain can also be affected by other irregularities with your reproductive health. So, for example, someone who has cysts, and someone who has IBS, for example. This is all in chronic illness and chronic conditions that affect people long term, right? So for situations like this, US, UK, Australia, and a few different other countries have this lanyard that is bright green with sunflowers on it. And it is called the Hidden Disability Sunflower Lanyard. If you're wearing it, people will recognize it and people will know that you have an access need. You can also choose to wear a card on it if you're nonverbal, for example, saying, this is my access need, please offer me a seat. for example. Singapore has one. You can ask for a lanyard that basically in their train systems that it basically says on the card, please offer me a seat. I have an invisible disability. Malaysia has one. I just got one of my own recently. It is called the butterfly lanyard. It is under the Malaysian airport, the Butterfly Effects campaign. It is basically to ensure that your journey in public transport and at the airport is as fluid as possible. So this time I actually had the opportunity to use the Butterfly Effects lanyard, and it was incredible because during security, during anything, I was given so much time to process what was going on. During check-in, they told me word for word what was going to happen, what I needed to expect. It comes with a little brochure that basically says how to go through security in step by step. Like, this is what you need to take off, remove everything in your pocket, empty all your water bottles, separate your laptops, and it's all in the brochure. And for someone who requires step-to-step instructions to do something, that was so helpful for me. And even around the airports, they have sensory walls where you can just go and to calm yourself. They have like these little puzzles that you can do, and it's really nice. And they also have a calm room, which is a low sensory room. The lights are a little dark. It's not overwhelming. There are little fidget tools in there that you can use. And this was in Malaysia.
Do you know if this sort of thing would be abused by so-called quotation normal people?
Like, do you need to do any kind of application in order to get those, like a lanyard or anything?
Malaysia requires it. Other countries don't. And I prefer that they don't require it because it can be very stressful. Like, for example, what if someone does not have a diagnosis? Someone can't afford a diagnosis. Someone doesn't have a psychiatrist to be able to give given a diagnosis.
Yeah, that's why I think about that as well, because to me, I imagine if it were to be implemented in our environment, like in our society here, it would not necessarily work because of how people here could take advantage of this particular process.
But this is what I will say, though. A lot of people have the same idea about using wheelchairs at the airport, that most people don't need it. But the percentage of people who don't actually need it is probably less than 1%. It's very likely that most people who access these services actually require it, actually need it. And if we keep adding barriers to it, it makes it harder for people to actually access it. There's probably less than a 2% chance that people are going to abuse it, because welcome to ableism. People don't want to be said that they're disabled. In Thailand, they just say, oh, what did you do in your past life to be disabled this life? People don't want to be labeled that way. People don't want to hear those remarks. We don't want to hear those remarks too. And that is why I genuinely think that people are not going to abuse it. It's just a matter of education. It's just a matter of telling people that these services that are being provided are not there to skip lines, and these services are being provided and to meet the needs of people who actually have access needs. And that is it. And I feel like with that form of education and with that form of understanding, it is very unlikely that people are going to abuse it. In Malaysia, for example, I was the only one in probably all the hundreds and thousands of people I saw at the airport that was wearing a butterfly lanyard. Anyone could have done that because they get to skip lines, but they didn't.
Do you know if the Malaysian government actually educated the people in this particular topic?
For sure. I think they don't go door to door and educate, but there are a lot of videos that are talking about it, even on the Malaysian airport Instagram pages. There everywhere in the airport, there are signs that basically has a butterfly on it, and it explains what the butterfly lanyard is for people and things like that. And it's simple, it's easy. I think the only thing with Malaysia is that they require a diagnosis. And so I had to show my diagnosis this time. But in the US and in Canada, in Australia, I have used my sunflower lanyard before, and I never had to prove anything. No one goes out of their way to abuse those systems either. It's very easy to abuse those systems, and people don't.
Speaking back to the particular aspect of being identified, I'm wondering, like, while you were using the experience of the butterfly lanyard, did you feel like people were looking at you as a disabled person? And did you feel like that, as good as the process was as well? I wonder, do you feel like that particular lanyard also gave you a tag? Because I feel like there is, because we don't want to be identified, right. But at the same time, having that is an identification that you are disabled. Therefore, people understand that in the, general public, when they see that, we respect that they're disabled, and we will give them some space. We will also support them if they need to. So I'm just sort of going back and forth with the concept of like the identification. Like, we may not want it, but we need to at the same time. So did that particular experience made you feel like it was putting you on a tag?
There are definitely pros and cons. Like, it's quite easy to implement certain campaigns like this and certain initiatives like this without making it very obvious. Sunflower lanyard, for example, it's not just the lanyard. They have a wrist tag, wristband that is much more subtle. They also have like a little pin that you can wear. It's very, very subtle. Most people won't even see it. So there are things like that can be done, right? I specifically never ever felt that people were treating me any different apart from airport staff. And airport staff were there to support me as needed. So I need to clarify a little bit. When I say any different, I'm also a wheelchair user at the airports. So any way that they would treat a wheelchair user, that's how I was treated. Other than airport staff, right? So yeah, people have a tendency to stare because I'm young and I use a wheelchair, and people often don't see that. So they have a tendency to stare and have this mindset that only a specific kind of person requires mobility aids, but anyone can require mobility aids. And that's a kind of like community it is. You never know. It is one of the only things, right? You never know when you can become disabled. It is something that affects eventually everyone. Accessibility is not just for disabled communities. It is for everyone. It will eventually help you and support you. You get into a car accident. You have a broken leg. You need accessible spaces. You need accessibility. And so when we advocate for disability inclusion, we're not just doing it for our own communities, but the way that we approach it, or I approach it, I wouldn't say we, but because other people might approach it differently. But the way I approach it is I really make sure that people know that the communities and like the time that we are in is an aging society, and us or me advocating for accessibility right now will help me when I grow older and will help everyone else as they grow older.
I love this because this is actually where I want to take our conversation. I wonder, since when in your life did you realize that you are a disabled individual? And also, why did you decide to advocate for such things?
So I got my first ADHD diagnosis when I was 20. Growing up, I always knew something was wrong with me because like I had a lot of health challenges. I have been on medication my entire life, whether it's for like fainting, whether it's for anemia or any other conditions. But I really came to terms with my disability and understanding how much internalized ableism I actually had in 2019. Like, I got really sick after taking a vaccine because I found out I was allergic to it. And after that, it just kept deteriorating. And then I finally got a diagnosis for cutaneous vasculitis, which does not have a cure. And it basically affects your blood vessels to the point where your joints hurt. And then I was diagnosed with depression, PTSD, anxiety, and fibromyalgia. And fibromyalgia is roving pain in your muscles. And so on some days it can be good, some days it's not so good. It has over 200 different symptoms and it's very hard to diagnose. And it is a very easy slap-on diagnosis too sometimes that like, oh, you must have fibromyalgia. Yeah, it affects a lot of people around the world. So that was the first time I understood that I have been made to believe by society that young people cannot be disabled. And then I found a community of my own online, and I heard from other people who were going through the same as I did, and they labeled themselves disabled. And I was like, wait, hang on a second. I have found my community. I found my people. I started talking with other disability activists, and I very quickly realized that in the LGBTIQ community specifically, how inaccessible everything was, how inaccessible Pride was. And I went to my first Pride with my walking cane, and I was struggling. This was in 2022. Oh boy, I was struggling. It was a long walk. And then after that, I came back home and I just slept for 3 days. And then I went to my next Pride with my wheelchair. And this was in Patumwan, from BACC all the way to Central World. And that is a long, long walk too. I'm glad I had my friends with me who were able to roll me. Otherwise, my arms would be dead. But that Pride was tough. Trying to figure out ways to get to the main space. And like the organizers were not very transparent about accessibility at all, or they were not very communicative about accessibility at all. There was no water provisions, for example, and it was tough. It was like, and we had to wait like long hours, and it was a lot of people, and it was not the best. I also had like a lot of comments from like passerbys that I was so brave to come out and be a part of Pride while I was disabled. And that in itself is so degrading for me, because it's like, I'm just trying to live my life. I'm just trying to be a part of my community. Why do you have to go out of your way and enforce your ableism on me? And this idea of how inspiring disabled people are, that they are doing all of these things despite their disability, is one of the most, I would say, probably very, very degrading things I have heard. I don't like thinking in that aspect of it. And then this Pride, I decided to leave both my wheelchair and my cane at home. Well, I did bring my cane, but I didn't use it. And I had a bunch of really negative experiences. I was trying to find a disability-friendly toilet, couldn't find it. The bathrooms were only available in the malls, and it was really hard to go up to the malls without being met by stairs. Another thing was the toilets that was provided at the site itself had stairs going up because it was like a truck toilet. You know, those like the mobile toilets, and those have like really high steps. water was only provided at the beginning. Otherwise, like, you would have to go and find your own water. We stood around in the heat for maybe like 2 hours before we could even start. And even then, it took like another 2 hours to just like reach the end. And it was just overall not a good experience. Literally 2 weeks later, on my social media, I see photos of wheelchair users at Pride being paraded on the social media accounts of the organizers. And it's frustrating because
They didn't give them much thought, and they're using them to promote for a cause.
you're tokenizing us. And that's what it feels like, because there were a lot of police presence at Pride this year. And one of the things that I noticed a lot was how unsafe it felt for someone like me. I walked through the police checkpoint, and I was trying to come back out the same way because the exit was very far and I had to walk like a long way, right? And like, as someone who can't exert that much energy, I tried to explain to the police, and I was wearing a shirt that says, "Not all disabilities are visible." And I literally went up to the police and I was like, "Can I go out this way? Because I cannot walk around. I have a disability. I cannot walk far distances." And I very appropriately explained, and my partner was with me at that time. And the police started like asking me questions. What kind of disability? What disability do you have? And I told them, I was like, I can't walk long distances. Firstly, it's illegal to ask what kind of disability you have. I don't know if that is accurate in Thailand, but it is not appropriate to ask what kind of disability someone has. But they were asking me multiple questions about it. What kind of disability? 2 different people asked me that. And I explained it to them like that I have a disability where it affects my joints and I can't walk far. And they were like, "No, you can't go out this way. You have to walk around." And I did. So we eventually walked around. My partner was upset. She was so angry. And I was like, this is what we have to deal with on our day to day, because people will just not understand. And that's the LGBT space for us too. Like, so many events for us are not accessible. And so we don't show up. And then people are like, we invite disabled people, but they don't show up. And it's not just that. The disabled people that they invite are not people who require infrastructure accessibility. Like, they invite deaf and hard of hearing people, and they provide a sign language interpreter. Good job. What if someone doesn't understand sign language? What if someone who is deaf and hard of hearing, but is also blind? What about accessibility then? How are you going to ensure that? And I think it's very easy for them to say that they are accessible just because they have a sign language interpreter. But that is the only surface level understanding that they have of disability. And that's what frustrates me. And that's why I said that I will not be returning to Pride next year because of this reason, unless and until they're willing to change it, which is very unlikely.
I'm wondering, do you think like a guide dog would be something that can happen in Thailand?
For sure. There are a lot of spaces that actually allow guide dogs and like service animals. But people, especially who come from abroad, they have this sense of like, oh, we have a registration for our service animal. There is no actual registration or official registration for service animals. Most of the registrations that come from the US especially are all fake. There is no governmental registration. There are only 2 questions you are allowed to ask about your service animal. Is this a service animal, and what kind of services it provides? That is it. Those are the only 2 questions. You're not allowed to ask any more questions. How does the service animal help you? That's it. Those are the only questions you're supposed to ask.
I feel like there could be, like, even if there is service animals, a lot of places in Thailand does not allow animals in, you know? It's really difficult in that sense. Like most buildings don't really allow animals in, even if there are service animals. I don't know how that will go.
I think overall, like, after hearing what Shane shared with us today, something popped up. I don't know if it's relevant, just something really random. So we all know the theory of limited edition, or whenever things are limited, people tend to want more of it. So what if everything is provided? Accessible parking, or every facilities that needs to be provided, or all of the procedure or services, everything is just provided to everyone without having to classify this is for that group, this group. So there's no this sense of, oh, that is limited to certain things. So it becomes, that kind of psychological, I don't know what is it called. So what if everything is all of a sudden available to everyone else? Then maybe there wouldn't be the problem of some people wanting to abuse the system because they just wanted the benefit or convenience out of it. So I'm not, just some random thoughts that pop up that not sure if it's relevant. So, but it's quite interesting to myself. So another thing that I got from Shane's sharing today is that after all, I think all we need is really more, should I use the word compassionate, or the mindset of let's just care for the person next to us a little bit more, have more thoughts into the things that we do, and not just do based on how we think it is, because we never know who the person sitting next to us would need. So yeah, be more compassionate and be more considerate to the things that are happening around us. Maybe that would help make the world a little bit more beautiful than the way it is now.
I totally agree with what you said, Sin. My biggest takeaway would be a little kindness goes a very long way, because I very quickly realized too that sometimes in our very busy lives, we are so busy, we forget about what other people faces throughout their lives, and also the things that they have to go through. And therefore, we are very quick to judge in terms of like, oh, you're not disabled, but they actually are, and then we just assume that they're not. And how we go about to make sure that we can help each other and support each other in times of need, right? So I want to also thank Shane for being here and like telling us all these experience that you've been through. Do you have any last summaries or takeaways you'd like the listeners to know about this particular topic before we finish?
Oh, that's a tough one.
I know, because there is so much more to unpack. I'm sure this is just the tip of the iceberg that we're discussing right now. And I would love for us to have more and more detailed discussions, because this is an ongoing agenda, right? And it's always developing and always changing. But it's very lovely to get to have, at least to learn from the basics first, to get to understand and get to appreciate and get to love each other a little bit more and understand this topic a little bit more.
Just to wrap it up, if listeners want to read more about it, it's a really good idea to start following queer disabled people on social media who actually provide some of these stories day to day. Disabled Eliza is a really, really good resource on Instagram. Lydia, who is the founder of Autistic Hoya, I think that's how it's pronounced, Lydia X Brown. They are an incredible resource of disability and queerness. And there's so many more other queer disabled people who are sharing all of these stories and are educating people. And I think it's so incredible to see that. So go follow them and go read up more about these issues, because it will eventually affect everyone. And even if you don't know, maybe your friend could be queer, your colleague could be queer, your loved one could be queer. You never know. And your loved one could also be disabled.
when people are speaking about certain topics that they're very close to, I can only hope that we all also take action and listen. It's so important, just like what Shane said in this whole discussion. Yes, it is important that people speak up about things that they want their loved ones and the people close to them or the society in general to take action and take notice. But it is not their job to consistently educate the people, and it's not their job that these people we shouldn't be like ignorant and sitting and not take any responsibilities on issues that are existing. I feel like when there are opportunities, when topics like this come up, it's so important for all of us to listen and take action and not do anything and blame those that are already speaking up, that they're not speaking loud enough. I think that is irresponsible. So yeah, like listen when things are said.
Definitely, I would say I learned a lot about disability topics today, especially in Thailand and in particular to the queer community as well. At first, I thought, maybe it's like a minority thing, but after today, I realized that no, it's not a minority thing. It's actually like a huge thing that everyone is potentially experiencing, because the definition that we were taught about disability is mostly leaning towards physical, but we were never, at least for myself, I was never educated that disability can also be invisible. I just never know. So with that new definition that I learned today, then I realized this is not a minority thing. This is a huge, huge thing, because we all have invisible disability that we don't know yet about us or about someone next to us. So thank you a lot, Shane, for educating us today.
Happy to be here.
That's a wrap on today's episode of Buddy Time. A big thank you to Shane for shining a light on the critical importance of understanding and embracing disability inclusion. As we've explored today, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to uncover. We encourage you to stay aware, support inclusion, and take action whenever you can. We look forward to bringing you more in-depth discussion on this and relating topics soon. Until then, stay curious, stay kind, and see you in the next episode.